He made his wife kneel on the kitchen floor and wash his feet. And while she knelt there, basin in both hands, water still warm, his business partner watching from across the table, her phone sat in the pocket of her apron with a message she had already read twice that morning. A message from the executive secretary of the Mei-Lin family office, confirming that a 7-year probate process had just reached its end, confirming that she was now free to assume full control of $120 billion. He did not know that. His mother, seated at the head of the table with her tea and her verdict already written, did not know that. Vivian, the woman whose name had recently appeared on a charity gala seating chart in the space where Mei-Lin's name used to be, she did not know it either. What none of them knew on that ordinary Shanghai morning, with 4 dishes going cold on the table and the Huangpu River moving silently outside the window, was that the woman on her knees owned the walls around them, owned the company whose logo sat on Director Fang's business card, owned, in every legal sense that would soon matter enormously, the future that Huang Wei believed he was building without her. This is not simply a story about a man who forgot who he married. It's a story about what 7 years of quiet preparation looks like when it finally decides to stand up. If you believe that real strength doesn't announce itself, give this video a like before we go any further. And subscribe, because the stories we tell here are for people who understand that patience is not weakness. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what Mei-Lin did next, we have to go back to where this really began. The story really began not in that penthouse dining room, but in a garden in Suzhou, 22 years earlier, where a quiet man taught his daughter that everything worth having arrives without announcement. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the kitchen. The 4 dishes were already plated by the time the Huangpu River caught its first gray light. Steamed egg with century-preserved, braised pork shoulder that had been on since midnight, a cold cucumber salad dressed with black vinegar, and congee so smooth it moved like silk in the bowl. Mei-Lin had been awake since 4:30. This was not unusual. She cooked in the mornings the way other women breathed, without deciding to, without expecting thanks, because her father had taught her that care, given freely, costs nothing and means everything, and some lessons live in the hands long after the teacher's gone. She was at the sink rinsing the last pot when she heard Mrs. Huang Sr.'s voice from the dining room, clear and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Mei-Lin, Wei's feet are hurting again. Come." She dried her hands on the cloth tucked at her waist. She filled the ceramic basin, the one she had chosen herself, blue glaze fired in a small kiln in Jingdezhen, the one she had paid for with her own account, with warm water, and she carried it into the dining room. Huang Wei was reading his phone. He did not look up. Director Fang Jianhao sat across the table with his tea, and he looked at his tea. Mrs. Huang Sr. watched from the head of the table, with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite indifference, but lived precisely between the two. Mei-Lin set the basin on the floor. She knelt. The tile was cold through the thin fabric of her trousers. She removed her husband's slippers one at a time and placed his feet in the warm water, and she washed them, carefully, without rushing, the way she did everything. While the morning light arrived over the river, and the food she had made since midnight sat cooling on the table. No one spoke. Huang Wei scrolled. When she stood, basin in both hands, water still warm, Mrs. Huang Sr. looked briefly at the room and said, "To no one and to everyone. At least she's useful for something." Director Fang lifted his teacup. Huang Wei turned a page he wasn't reading. Mei-Lin carried the basin back to the kitchen. She set it in the sink. She placed both hands flat on the counter and looked out at the river, which was moving the way it always moved, without explanation, without apology, in only one direction. Her chest was still, her face was composed. The only evidence of anything at all was a single slow breath she allowed herself before she reached into the pocket of her apron and looked for the second time that morning at the message that had arrived at 5:47 a.m. It was from Lin Shu, executive secretary of the Mei-Lin family office. A woman Mei-Lin had known since childhood. A woman who wrote emails the way her father had spoken, with precision, without decoration. Probate finalized. You may now assume full control. Please advise on timing. 7 words that had taken 7 years to arrive. The Mei-Lin family office managed $120 billion, pharmaceutical patents registered across 11 countries, a 31% equity stake in Jiangnan Semiconductor Group, commercial real estate in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, and Seoul. And not quietly, several layers down in a holding structure that Mei-Lin's father had assembled with the patience of a man who understood that the most important architecture is never the most visible. A 34% controlling interest in Pinnacle Capital Holdings, the parent company of HW Technology Holdings, the company whose logo sat on Director Fang's business card, which was lying on the dining room table 6 feet away. Mei-Lin did not reply to the message, not yet. She plated the last of the congee, lifted the tray, and carried it to the table herself. She set each bowl down with both hands. She moved around the room without sound, and as she moved, she took quiet inventory of the 3 people seated there. Huang Wei, who had not looked at her once this morning, whose company she had quietly owned a controlling interest in for 7 years, through a structure so clean and so distant from his name that his own lawyers had never connected it to her. Mrs. Huang Sr., who had just pronounced her usefulness to a room that included the managing director of a company her daughter-in-law controlled. Director Fang, who had watched her kneel on cold tile and had found his teacup more interesting, and whose business card bore the red and black logo of Pinnacle Capital Holdings, and who would, in 48 hours, be sitting in a boardroom where the geometry of everything he thought he understood would be permanently rearranged. None of them looked at her. She returned to the kitchen. She removed her apron. She folded it over the back of a chair and walked quietly down the hall to the bedroom, where she sat on the edge of the bed and held her phone in both hands and looked at the message until the words blurred slightly at the edges. Then she closed her eyes, and from somewhere much further away than memory, from a garden in Suzhou, from a morning that smelled of osmanthus and turned earth, from the last year her father was well enough to sit outside, his voice arrived. Not loud. It never had been. She let it come. Mei-Lin was not the kind of man who filled a room with his presence. He was the kind of man who made you aware, only after he had gone, of how much quieter the room had become. He had built his first acquisition at 31, a small pharmaceutical distribution license in Jiangsu province that most of his competitors considered too modest to bother with. They were not wrong that it was modest. They were entirely wrong about what it was connected to. That was the thing about Mei-Lin's father. He understood that the most consequential structures are almost always invisible from the outside, that real architecture is never the facade but the foundation, and that the men who spent their energy announcing what they owned were always too busy announcing to notice what they were missing. By the time Mei-Lin was 12, the Mei-Lin family office managed holdings across 4 industries and 11 provinces. She knew this not because her father told her, but because he sat her down every Sunday evening at the long table in the Suzhou estate study and handed her a balance sheet and waited. He did not explain. He asked questions. He corrected her analysis without condescension, in the same tone he used when teaching her to read. Not impatient, not indulgent, simply precise. She learned to read numbers the way other children learned to read characters, as a language that, once understood, could not be unlearned. There was a board meeting she remembered from when she was 16. A rival executive, a broad, loud man from a Shenzhen conglomerate, spent 40 minutes in that room explaining, in escalating detail, the scale of what his family controlled. The numbers grew with each sentence. The other men around the table nodded and performed impressedness. Her father sat with his hands folded and said nothing at all. On the drive home, he looked out the window at the canal and said, almost to himself, "Power that announces itself is power that has already begun to shrink." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. She was 16 and she understood it as completely as she had ever understood anything. The Shenzhen executives conglomerate filed for restructuring 4 years later. The Mei-Lin family office quietly acquired 2 of its subsidiary assets during the settlement process. Her father did not mention it. When Mei-Lin died, a cardiac event, swift and without drama, in the garden where he had taken his morning tea for 30 years, he left Mei-Lin everything. $120 billion in diversified holdings, structured across 7 holding entities, managed through the family office he had spent 4 decades assembling, with the patience of a man who understood that the most important things are never rushed. His lawyers, a firm called Liang and Associates in Shanghai, called Mei-Lin 3 days after the funeral to explain the probate structure. It would take 7 years. This was deliberate. Her father had specified it in writing. He wanted her to have time to understand what she truly needed before she had access to what she truly had. She was 31 when he died. She was 38 now. The irony is that she met Huang Wei 9 months after the funeral at a charity auction in Suzhou benefiting a children's literacy initiative her father had funded for 15 years. Mei-Lin had attended out of loyalty to his memory and had expected to feel only grief. What she had not expected was a tall man in a dark jacket standing in front of a framed calligraphy piece with the expression of someone genuinely trying to understand it. Not performing appreciation, actually trying. She had stood beside him. They had talked for 2 hours without either of them mentioning what they did for work. He was different then. This is important, and the narrator will not let it be forgotten. He was genuinely different, curious, warm in the unpracticed way of someone who had not yet learned to make warmth strategic. He asked questions and then listened to the answers instead of preparing his next question. He drove her home and shook her hand at the door. A handshake, formal and slightly awkward, which made her smile for the first time in months. Over the following weeks, he sent messages that were too long and occasionally misspelled. He brought her osmanthus cake from a bakery near his office that he had clearly researched. He was trying, not performing, trying. They married 14 months later in a small ceremony in Suzhou, the city where they had met and where her father was buried. 3 weeks before the wedding, Margaret Say, who had managed the Chen-Lin estate since Chen Baolin's death and had served as his personal counsel for 11 years before that, placed a prenuptial agreement in front of Huang Wei's lawyer, a junior associate named Philip Quan from a mid-sized commercial practice. The agreement ran to 47 pages. The schedule of exemptions, which specified all separate property belonging to Mei-Lin, ran to 11 more. Philip Quan reviewed it for 20 minutes and told Huang Wei it was standard. Huang Wei signed without reading past the first page. That signature would matter. Not yet, but eventually. In the wedding photograph that Mei-Lin kept in the private apartment she would acquire 3 years later, Huang Wei is not looking at the camera. He is looking at her. His expression is unguarded in the way that expressions can only be when a person does not know they are being watched. It is the only photograph of their marriage in which he is looking at her that way. The narrator notes this without elaboration. It was the last one. The coldness did not arrive all at once. That is the thing about this kind of erosion. It never announces itself. It accumulates the way sediment does, layer by invisible layer, until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath you is not the ground you remember standing on. The first year of the marriage had been, if not perfect, then genuinely warm. Huang Wei worked long hours but came home present. He asked about her day and meant it. He still reached for her hand in restaurants. The second year, the reaching stopped. Not dramatically, not with an argument or a declared withdrawal. He simply began arriving home already somewhere else. His mind still in the office, his attention already on the next day's problems. And Mei-Lin learned to read the particular quality of his silence that meant he was not available and to arrange herself around it without comment. She was good at arranging herself. She had grown up in a quiet household. She understood that stillness was not the same as absence. But then Mrs. Huang Sr. began to stay. It started as extended visits, a week here, a long weekend there, and became, by the 3rd year, a permanent residency that no one formally declared. She simply stopped leaving. Her things redistributed themselves through the penthouse with the gentle inevitability of water finding low ground. Her preferred teacups in the front cabinet, her schedule dictating the rhythm of Sunday mornings, her opinions about the household arriving as observations rather than instructions, which made them considerably harder to address. The dinner incident happened in the 3rd year. Mei-Lin had spent 2 days planning a meal for 4 couples, friends from the early days of the marriage, people who still remembered her as a person rather than a fixture. She had ordered ingredients from a specialist market on Wuzhong Road, had laid the table herself that morning. Mrs. Huang Sr. arrived in the kitchen at noon, looked at the preparations, and made a single phone call. By 6 o'clock, the menu had been replaced entirely with catered dishes from a restaurant she preferred. Three of Mei-Lin's friends had been quietly uninvited and replaced with Mrs. Huang Sr.'s own acquaintances. And Huang Wei, when Mei-Lin found him in the study to ask what had happened, looked briefly uncomfortable and said only, "She meant well. Let it go." She let it go. At a family gathering 6 months later, she overheard Mrs. Huang Sr. telling a cousin that Mei-Lin struggles a little. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of life. The cousin had nodded sympathetically. Mei-Lin had stood in the hallway with a tray of fruit she was carrying to the table, and had continued to the table and set it down and smiled at the room. Her hands were perfectly still. The tray made no sound. The diagnosis came in the 4th year. Systemic lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition that explained the fatigue she had been managing quietly for 18 months, the joint pain she had attributed to poor sleep, the inflammation that had twice sent her to a hospital she attended alone, because Huang Wei had been traveling and she had not wanted to worry him. The rheumatologist, Dr. Fen Mei Xing at Ruijin Hospital, delivered the diagnosis with clinical precision and recommended a treatment protocol involving quarterly infusions and regular monitoring. Huang Wei accompanied her to the first appointment. He sat in the consultation room with his phone face down on his knee, which Mei-Lin recognized as his version of attention. He asked 2 questions. Both were about timelines. How long until the treatment stabilized, when she would be at full function? Dr. Fen answered carefully. On the drive home, Huang Wei was quiet. He said eventually, "We'll manage it." He attended the 2nd appointment. He did not attend the 3rd. After the 4th, Mei-Lin stopped mentioning the appointments at all, and he stopped asking. She began taking the metro to Ruijin Hospital alone, sitting in the infusion suite for 3 hours with a novel and a thermos of tea she prepared herself, watching the other patients in their chairs, each one accompanied by somebody or not. She noticed that year that she had begun attending most things alone, and then came Vivian. The name appeared first in Huang Wei's schedule. Mei-Lin glimpsed it on his open laptop, V. Chen, recurring across Tuesday afternoons with the regularity of a standing meeting. She told herself it was a client. Then a hotel loyalty points notification arrived on the shared email account they used for household bills. 10,000 points earned at the Ritz-Carlton Pudong, a Tuesday in March. During the hours Huang Wei had been in a meeting she had not been invited to query. She told herself there was an explanation. Then his phone began spending nights face down on the nightstand, and when it buzzed after 11, he took it to the bathroom. And when he returned, his expression had the particular smoothness of someone who had just composed himself. She did not confront him. She was not ready. She was still, in that period, extending to him a generosity he had long since stopped earning, because generosity was structural to her in a way that contempt was not, and because her father had taught her that the decision to act should never be made from a place of uncertainty. Then the gala seating chart arrived in her email by accident. A forwarded attachment from the charity committee she served on. A table plan for the Shanghai Cultural Foundation annual dinner, which she had attended for 3 consecutive years with Huang Wei at her side. She opened it out of habit. She found the table assigned to Huang Wei's company. She found his name. She found, in the seat beside his where her name had appeared for 3 previous years, the name, Chen Vivienne. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop. The scene softened into something very quiet. She sat for a long time at the kitchen table where she had eaten breakfast alone for the past 11 months. Then she went to the 2nd bedroom, the one Mrs. Huang Sr. used as a sitting room when she was in residence, the one Mei-Lin had converted, in the small hours of evenings like this one, into a place that was entirely her own. And she opened the locked drawer of the writing desk. Inside was a manila folder. She had started it 3 months ago, when the hotel notification arrived. It held 4 items, now it held 5. She placed the seating chart photograph inside. She locked the drawer. She stood with both hands resting flat on the desk surface and breathed once, slowly, and told herself she needed more certainty before she decided anything. She was not wrong about that. She was simply wrong about how much longer certainty would take to arrive. The folder in the locked drawer now held 5 items. Mei-Lin did not add to it immediately. She gave herself another month of watching, Another month of measuring the distance between what she suspected and what she could prove. Another month of the particular discipline her father had modeled for her across a lifetime. Never move until the picture is complete. The picture completed itself without her help. It began on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months before the morning with the basin. Mei-Lin was at the pharmacy on Huaihai Road, the one she used for her treatment-related prescriptions, a quiet place run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Song, who always wrapped her packages in brown paper without being asked. Mei-Lin presented her card for a purchase of 340 yuan, immunosuppressants and a vitamin protocol Dr. Fen had recommended. The card declined. She presented it again. Mrs. Song looked at the terminal with the careful neutrality of a woman who had seen this before, and handed the card back without comment. Mei-Lin paid cash. She walked to her car. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and then drove home. When she asked Huang Wei about it that evening, he was already in his study. He did not turn around. "I simplified the account structure," he said. "You don't need a supplementary card. Ask me if you need money for something." Ask me. She was 37 years old, the sole trustee of $120 billion in global holdings, and her husband had just told her to ask him for money for her medication. She did not say this. She said, "All right." He nodded. He returned to his screen. The irony is almost architectural. The card he canceled drew from a joint account that held at any given time approximately 40,000 yuan. The accounts he did not know existed, the Chen-Lin family office operating accounts, structured across entities in Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands, held the remainder of what his company depended on for its parent company's quarterly liquidity. He had canceled her 40,000. He had not touched the rest. He didn't know the rest existed. He didn't think to look. What followed the card cancellation was a quiet, methodical removal of her autonomy, piece by piece, each piece framed as something else. He took a second key to the penthouse in November. "For emergencies," he said, though he did not say whose emergencies he had in mind. He began requiring her to send him her weekly medical schedule so he could plan around it, which meant she now reported her movements to a man who had not accompanied her to a medical appointment in 16 months. Each restriction arrived wrapped in the language of concern, which made it very difficult to object to without sounding ungrateful for being worried about. Mrs. Huang Sr., meanwhile, had expanded her campaign beyond the household. At a dinner hosted by Huang Wei's CFO, a man named Zheng Bo-wen, Mei-Lin arrived to find two of the other guests treating her with a specific careful gentleness, the kind extended to someone fragile or unreliable or both. One of them, a woman named Cao Ling, whose husband managed logistics for HW Technology's supply chain, touched Mei-Lin's arm at the door and said, "You look tired, dear. Is it the treatment?" With an expression of such preemptive sympathy that Mei-Lin understood in that moment exactly what Mrs. Huang Sr. had been saying about her in rooms she was not in. She looked tired because she was tired. The treatment cycles were not gentle. They left her with a fatigue that settled deep in her joints and required 3 days of careful rest to metabolize. She had managed this privately, without complaint, for 2 years. That her body's honest response to an honest illness had been converted, in someone else's mouth, into evidence of instability. This was the cruelty she found hardest to absorb. Not because it surprised her, because it was so deliberate. Then came December. Huang Wei contacted his bank to restructure the household accounts and attempted to remove Mei-Lin's name from the primary joint account. The bank's compliance officer, following standard procedure, sent a form to Mei-Lin's registered address requiring her countersignature and a copy of documentation confirming her identity and tax residency. The documentation the form required was held under her legal name, Chen Mei-Lin, not Huang Mei-Lin, not the name on any account Huang Wei had ever seen. The form came back to the bank flagged for clarification. Huang Wei's bank manager called him. He was irritated. He told the manager to find another way. The manager said there wasn't one. Huang Wei called it a bureaucratic inconvenience and moved on. He did not ask Mei-Lin about the name discrepancy. It did not occur to him that there was anything to ask. This is the closest he ever came. And he walked past it the way a man walks past a door he has decided does not open. Vivian Chen attended Huang Wei's industry events openly now. There was no longer any performance of professional justification. She stood beside him at the Shanghai Technology Forum in January, with the ease of a woman who had stopped caring who noticed, because the person whose noticing had once mattered had been quietly reclassified in her mind as someone who no longer counted. Mei-Lin was not at the forum. Huang Wei had told her she was too unwell to attend. The treatment that week had been particularly difficult. He was not wrong that she was tired. He was entirely wrong about what her tiredness meant. By February, she was attending her infusion sessions at Ruijin Hospital on Tuesday afternoons, checking in at the front desk, taking her numbered ticket, finding her chair in the suite, and sitting for 3 hours while the medication moved through her body. She brought a thermos. She brought a novel she rarely read. She watched the door through which, on every one of these Tuesday afternoons, no one came. On the last Tuesday of February, she held her ticket, number 47 printed in pale blue ink, and looked at the door for a long moment after her session ended. Then she placed the ticket in her bag, with the folder, with the 5 items she had been collecting since October. The next time she sat in this waiting room, she would not be alone. She did not know that yet, but she was beginning to understand that she needed to decide. She had been sitting in the Ruijin Hospital waiting room for 40 minutes when they arrived. It was a Tuesday, her 3rd infusion round of the current cycle. The treatment always left her with a particular quality of exhaustion. Not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, but something that settled deeper, into the marrow, as if her body were conducting a slow internal negotiation that required all available resources and could not be interrupted. Her face was pale in the way that treatment days always made it pale. Her wrists were thin above the plastic hospital band. She was wearing a gray cardigan that she had pulled close around her soft shoulders, and she had a novel open in her lap that she had not read a word of in 20 minutes because her eyes kept closing without her permission. She heard Mrs. Huang Sr.'s voice first. It entered the waiting room before she did, the way it always did. Unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who had never once needed to announce herself. Huang Wei was a step behind her, suited, his jaw set in the configuration Mei-Lin had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he had made a decision he considered final and unpleasant and wanted it completed quickly. He was carrying an envelope. Mei-Lin looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. She understood. She sat very still. The nurse at the intake desk, a young woman whose badge read Lin Fangyu, looked up briefly and then looked back at her screen. A second nurse, older, named Wei Jingmei, paused in the doorway of the corridor with a medication cart and did not move. Huang Wei crossed the waiting room and held the envelope out to Mei-Lin. He did not sit. He did not lower his voice. "These are divorce papers," he said in the tone he might have used to note a weather forecast. "The accounts have already been restructured. The legal process will be straightforward." Mei-Lin took the envelope. Her hands did not shake. She placed it in her lap beside the novel she had not been reading. Mrs. Huang Sr., standing 2 steps behind her son, looked at Nurse Lin Fangyu and said, in a tone of sincere-sounding concern, "She gets confused sometimes. The illness affects her thinking. Please be patient with her if she has questions about the paperwork." She said it the way a person says something they have said before, in different rooms, to different listeners, until it has become comfortable in the mouth. The young nurse looked back at her screen. The older nurse, Wei Jingmei, did not look away. She watched Mei-Lin with an expression the narrator can only describe as recognition. The look of a woman who has seen this particular shape of thing before, and knows better than to name it aloud in the room where it is happening. Huang Wei continued. He spoke about the account restructuring, confirmed, complete, as though it were a logistical matter he was briefing a subordinate on. He spoke about the timeline for vacating the penthouse. He spoke about the legal representation she would need to arrange, and he recommended, without apparent irony, that she do so promptly. Then he said, with the same factual precision he had used for everything else, "Vivian will be more present in my life going forward. I think you understand the situation." Vivian, not someone else, not an implication or an omission. Her name, said in a hospital waiting room, in front of 2 nurses and an intake desk, with the ease of a man who had long since stopped considering what the name might cost to hear. Mei-Lin said, "I understand." She said nothing else. Mrs. Huang Sr. straightened her collar. Huang Wei pocketed his phone. They left together, his hand at his mother's elbow, their footsteps receding down the corridor with the brisk efficiency of people who have completed a task. The automatic doors opened and closed. The waiting room was very quiet. Lin Fangyu was looking at her screen. Wei Jingmei had pushed her medication cart forward again and disappeared around the corridor's bend. The overhead lighting buzzed faintly. Somewhere further in the building, a door opened and shut. A man across the room was reading a newspaper with great concentration, as people do when they have witnessed something they have decided not to have witnessed. Mei-Lin looked at the envelope in her lap. She thought about her father's garden in Suzhou, the osmanthus near the south wall, the stone bench where he had taken his tea on autumn mornings, the particular quality of the light there in early November when the mist came off the canal. She thought about the message she had received 3 days ago that she had not yet answered. Probate finalized. You may now assume full control. Please advise on timing. She had been waiting for the right moment. The certainty she had been building toward for 7 years arrived not dramatically but quietly, the way the most important things always arrived in her experience. Without announcement, without ceremony, simply present where it had not been before. She opened the envelope. She looked at the first page without reading it. She turned to the second and the third. She noted the date at the top, the case reference number, the name of the law firm, Qian and Wu Legal Partners, Jing'an District. She noted without surprise that her name was listed as Huang Mei-Lin. She had not been Huang Mei-Lin on a single legal document in 7 years. She was not Huang Mei-Lin on the probate instrument. She was not Huang Mei-Lin on the trust schedule, or the shareholder register, or the 47-page prenuptial agreement Huang Wei had signed without reading past the first page. She closed the envelope. She folded it along its original crease. She placed it in her bag, beside the folder that now held 6 items. Then she stood up. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She stood with her full weight on both feet, her soft hands steady at her sides, her hospital wristband still on her wrist, and she walked toward the exit the way her father had always walked through rooms, without hurry, without announcement, as if she already knew the destination and had simply been waiting for the appropriate hour to begin. The automatic doors opened. She walked out into the afternoon. She did not go back to the penthouse. She had not planned this consciously, but when she reached the street outside Ruijin Hospital with the afternoon light still pale above the Huangpu and her bag containing the divorce papers in the folder with its 6 items, her body made the decision before her mind did. She did not walk toward the metro line that would take her to Huangpu District. She walked toward the one that would take her to Shuhui. The apartment on Yongjia Road was on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a lane house and been converted quietly, without distinctive renovation, in 2006. Mei-Lin had leased it in the 3rd year of her marriage under the name Chen Mei-Lin, paying 12 months in advance through the family office's property management subsidiary. Huang Wei had never asked about it because she had never mentioned it, and she had never mentioned it because her father had taught her, by example rather than instruction, that the spaces in which you do your clearest thinking are worth protecting from the people who do not understand what thinking costs. She had not been here in 4 months. The air had the particular stillness of a room that has been waiting. She opened the windows. She set her bag on the desk, her father's desk, a plain rectangle of dark walnut that had stood in his study in Suzhou before she had it transported here after his death. And she stood for a moment with her palms flat on its surface. The apartment held very little. A desk, a chair, a narrow bed, a photograph on the windowsill of the Suzhou garden in autumn, the osmanthus in frame, the stone bench visible at the edge, and on the wall opposite the door, in a simple frame of black lacquered wood, the first balance sheet her father had ever handed her, typed on cream paper, dated when she was 12 years old, with her own handwriting in the margins where she had made notes during their Sunday evening sessions. He had kept it. She had not known he kept it until she found it among his papers, carefully protected in an archival sleeve after he died. She looked at it for a long time. His voice arrived not as memory, not as something past, but as something present, quiet, without ceremony. The same words she had heard at 16 in a boardroom, while a loud man made himself smaller with every syllable he added to his own description. Power that announces itself is power that has already begun to shrink. She understood it differently now than she had at 16. At 16, she had understood it as observation. At 31, when he died and she had stood at his graveside in Suzhou with the probate papers pending and the marriage new, and Huang Wei's hand in hers, she had understood it as instruction. Now standing at this desk in this small apartment at 38, still wearing a hospital wristband she had forgotten to remove, she understood it as description. It was not something she was working toward. It was something she had already become. The narrative shifts here. This is not a metaphor and not a device. It is simply what happened in that room on that evening. The woman who had spoken in complete, careful sentences with a beat of extra patience before each response, the woman who had arranged herself around other people's comfort for 7 years, the woman who had carried a ceramic basin on cold mornings and said nothing about any of it. That woman made a decision, and in the making of it became someone the narration will henceforth describe differently. Not harder, not colder, simply certain. She sat down at the desk. She took out her phone. She found the number for Margaret Say of Say & Partners, senior partner, private wealth and estate law, who had been Chen Baolin's personal counsel for 11 years and Mei-Lin's retained advisor for 4, and who had, at their first meeting after Chen Baolin's death, told Mei-Lin in 4 sentences exactly what the estate contained, what the probate would require, and what her options would be when it concluded. Margaret had not asked a single question that was not strictly necessary. Mei-Lin had not forgotten this. The phone rang twice. Margaret. A pause of exactly the length required. It's time. Margaret Say said, I'll need the venue. Mei-Lin told her, the Pinnacle Capital Holdings quarterly board meeting, Pudong Financial District, scheduled for the following morning at 9. She had known the date for 6 weeks. She had checked the agenda once, confirmed the attendees, and not thought about it again because there was nothing more to think about. Margaret said, shareholder notification, asset schedule, divorce settlement terms. Yes, the venue for the settlement signing. Mei-Lin told her that as well. The executive boardroom at Ruijin Hospital, a room whose naming rights had been donated to the Chen-Lin Foundation 6 months earlier, documented and filed in a transaction that had generated no press and required no announcement. A room that now bore her family's name on a small brass plate beside the door. She had not been there yet. She would sign the settlement there. She thought her father would have found this appropriately structured. Margaret said, I'll have everything to you by 7 a.m. Thank you. The call ended. 4 exchanges, 53 seconds. Mei-Lin placed the phone face down on the desk beside the framed balance sheet. She did not review what had just been set in motion. The documents had been prepared in draft for 4 months, awaiting only her instruction. Margaret required nothing further from her tonight. She did not sleep. She sat in her father's chair at her father's desk in the apartment that existed under her father's name for her and for no one else. And she let the hours pass the way her father had always let difficult things pass. Without resistance, without rushing, simply present with what was true until morning came and made action possible. The city moved outside the window. The river kept its direction. At 6:58 a.m., her phone illuminated with an incoming file from C & Partners, reference number CL292409 final. She did not open it. She already knew what it contained. She stood. She changed her clothes. She removed the hospital wristband at last and placed it, without knowing exactly why, in the desk drawer beside the folder with its 6 items. She put on the jacket her father had always preferred, a deep ink blue simply cut, the one she wore when she wanted to feel the weight of her own steadiness. Then she left the apartment, descended 4 flights, and walked out into the Shanghai morning. The Pinnacle Capital Holdings boardroom occupied the 31st floor of the Lujiazui Financial Tower, a glass and steel building in the Pudong district whose lobby directory listed 47 companies and whose elevator banks moved with the hushed efficiency of serious money. The boardroom itself was rectangular, long, with a view of the river that nobody in the room was currently looking at. A credenza along the east wall held water glasses and a carafe nobody had touched. The agenda had been distributed at 8:50. 6 items, standard quarterly review. The 7th item, added 2 days earlier, by the company's secretary at Margaret C's written instruction, read only, Principal Stakeholder Introduction. Huang Wei had not asked about it. He sat in his usual chair, third from the head on the right side, the position he had occupied for 4 years of quarterly meetings, near enough to the head to suggest authority, deferential enough to acknowledge the institutional investors who technically outranked him. Director Fang Jianhao sat across from him, his jacket pressed, his phone face down on the table, his expression carrying the professional neutrality of a man who had learned to read rooms before committing to any expression within them. 3 other board members completed the table: Wu Chengming from the institutional investment arm, Li Baoshan representing the original seed fund, and the board chair, Madame Chen Ruxia, 64, who had been briefed the previous evening and had not slept particularly well afterward. At 8:58, the door opened. Margaret Say entered first. She was carrying her single leather document case, and she moved to the head of the table without making eye contact with anyone, placing documents at the position to Madame Chen Ruxia's left with the focused efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed the geometry of this room in her mind many times over 4 years. Huang Wei watched her arrange the papers and assumed, reasonably, that this was the legal representative of a new institutional investor. He had seen this before. He straightened his jacket. Then the door opened again. Mei-Lin wore ink blue. The jacket her father had preferred, simply cut, no ornament. She walked to the head chair, the one to which Margaret had just delivered the documents, and she sat down. She placed both hands flat on the table. She did not look at Huang Wei. The room registered her presence in stages. Madame Chen Ruxia, who knew, looked at her and nodded once with the gravity of someone acknowledging a long overdue arrival. Li Baoshan frowned slightly, not rudely, but with the confusion of a man recalibrating an assumption. Wu Chengming looked from Mei-Lin to the document in front of him and back. Director Fang Jianhao looked at Mei-Lin and went very still. He had last seen her on a morning that now required no description. He recognized her. He recognized the desk, or rather, the absence of one. She was not serving anything. She was sitting at the head of a table, and the quality of her stillness in that chair was the same quality he had watched her carry across a penthouse dining room with a ceramic basin, and the understanding of what that meant arrived in him not gradually but all at once, like a door opening onto a drop. He did not look away. He simply stopped moving entirely. Huang Wei had not yet understood. He was still processing her presence as an anomaly. His wife, here, in this room, which was irregular but might be explained. He opened his mouth. Madame Chen Ruxia said precisely, "Shall we begin?" The board chair did not wait for an answer. She introduced Mei-Lin in the careful language of formal governance. Sole heir and principal trustee of the Chen-Lin family office. A portfolio of $120 billion in diversified global holdings, exercising a 34% controlling interest in Pinnacle Capital Holdings as the estate's largest single institutional position. She was, Madame Chen Ruxia noted, already familiar with the company's operations, having reviewed the quarterly filings for the previous 7 years under the family office's standard monitoring protocol. The room went absolutely silent. Director Fang Jianhao said under his breath, "Chen-Lin." He said it before Huang Wei did. He said it the way a person says a name they should have recognized much earlier and did not. And the saying of it was a kind of private accounting for that failure. Huang Wei's face did not change immediately. The information arrived in him in the manner of a structural shift, not visible on the surface, but registering in the particular stillness that settled over him, the way his hands, which had been resting loosely on the agenda, slowly flattened against the table. He said, "I don't," and stopped. Madame Chen Ruxia deferred smoothly to Margaret, who opened her document case and began. She read from the asset schedule calmly, item by item. Pharmaceutical patent holdings, semiconductor equity positions, commercial real estate across 6 cities, and then on page 4 of the schedule, the commercial lease portfolio, a list of properties held under Chen-Lin subsidiary entities currently occupied by various tenants. One of the entries was a retail and office property in Jing'an District. The tenant was listed as Huang Family Enterprises, a small administrative services company registered to Huang Baofang, Mrs. Huang Sr.'s business, on page 4, in the asset schedule of the woman she had dismissed as useful for something. Director Fang did not look up from the table. Huang Wei tried to speak a second time. He said, Mei-Lin, in a voice that was not cold and not loud, but was something the narrator will only describe as exposed, the voice of a man who has just understood the dimensions of a room he has been standing in for 7 years without ever measuring it. Madame Chen Ruxia raised one hand, a minimal gesture, and looked to Mei-Lin. Mei-Lin looked at her husband for the first time since entering the room. She had been waiting for the correct moment, and this was it. Not when he was speaking, but when he had run out of words. She looked at him the way her father had looked at the loud man in the boardroom 30 years ago, without anger, without satisfaction, simply from the correct altitude. She said, I own 34%. You own 8. Shall we begin? The silence that followed was the longest in the room's history. Then Madame Chen Ruxia said, Item 1 on the quarterly agenda. And Margaret began placing the divorce settlement terms in front of each board member with the quiet economy of someone completing a task that had been fully prepared for a very long time. The meeting continued. Huang Wei remained in his chair. He was not addressed again by anyone except the board secretary, who needed his initials on a procedural form, and who placed the form in front of him and waited without comment until he signed it. At 10:47, Mei-Lin signed the first document of the quarterly agenda. Her name, Chen Mei-Lin, her full and legal and only name, moved across the signature line in the unhurried script she had used since her father first taught her to sign her name on a document at 12 years old, explaining that a signature was not decoration, but declaration. The room knew the name. It had always known the name. Huang Wei was the last to learn it, which was, in every sense that mattered, exactly as her father had intended. The consequences arrived quietly, the way serious things do. Within 2 weeks of the shareholder meeting, the Pinnacle Capital Holdings Board convened a governance review of HW Technology Holdings' operational structure. The language in the summary document was precise and impersonal. Given the change in principal stakeholder composition, a review of executive role alignment was recommended. Huang Wei's title remained. His operational authority did not. By the end of the month, he had been restructured into a non-executive advisory position, the kind of role that retains the name without the function, that keeps a man at the table without letting him touch anything on it. Director Fang Jianhao issued a statement through his office expressing confidence in the new principal's stewardship. He did not mention Huang Wei by name. The industry press covered the transition in 2 paragraphs. The Chen-Lin family office's assumption of active control at Pinnacle Capital was noted as a significant portfolio development. Huang Wei's personal connection to the incoming principal was not mentioned, because no one who knew thought it served them to mention it, and the few who didn't know had no way to connect the names. Vivian Chen's marketing consultancy filed for voluntary dissolution 31 days after the contract non-renewal notice arrived from Pinnacle Capital's Accounts Payable Department. She did not make a public statement. She did not call Huang Wei. She simply stopped appearing in the places where he had been accustomed to finding her. The industry dinners, the lobby of his building, the Tuesday afternoons that had once been listed in his calendar as standing appointments. She was there, and then she was not, as cleanly and completely as a line deleted from a document. Mrs. Huang Sr. received a standard lease review letter from Chen-Lin Property Management, a subsidiary operating entity, referencing her Jing'an District commercial tenancy. The letter was signed by a portfolio administrator and requested updated business registration documentation within 30 days. She called Huang Wei. He answered on the 3rd attempt. He told her he was handling it. He was not handling it. There was nothing to handle. The lease review was standard procedure, and the outcome would be determined by the same documentation process that governed every other tenant in the portfolio. Mrs. Huang Sr.'s name held no special weight in those documents. It never had. Then Huang Wei came to Yongjia Road. It was a Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks after the board meeting. Mei-Lin heard the buzzer and looked at the intercom and recognized him on the small screen. The forward-leaning posture, the jaw set in the configuration she had learned across 9 years. She pressed the door release. She waited at the apartment door. He spoke for several minutes. He said things about misunderstanding, about time, about what they had built together, and about what he now understood that he had not understood before. His voice was not cold. It was the voice of a man who had finally stopped auditioning and did not know what was left of him without the performance. It was, in its way, the most honest she had ever heard him speak. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "I know." She did not say anything else. She did not invite him in. She closed the door without raising her voice and stood on the other side of it until she heard his footsteps recede down the stairwell. Then she went to her father's desk and sat down. The scene softened into something much quieter after that. Mei-Lin's treatment continued at Richest Hospital on Tuesday afternoons, as it had for 2 years. The difference was that she no longer arrived alone. Her assistant, a composed young woman named Yao Shufen, whom the family office had assigned to her at her request, accompanied her now, managing the paperwork, waiting in the corridor, ensuring that the thermos was filled and that the return car was confirmed. Small dignities. The narrator notes them not as triumphs, but as corrections. Things that should always have been true, now simply being true. In November, she drove to Suzhou for the first time since the board meeting. She brought the framed balance sheet from the wall of the Yongjie Road apartment, wrapped carefully in cloth, and she carried it through the gate of the Chen family estate and across the garden to the stone bench near the south wall, where her father had taken his morning tea for 30 years. The osmanthus was in bloom. The canal beyond the wall was moving in its usual direction, without explanation, without apology. She sat with the framed balance sheet resting against the garden wall beside her, and she looked at her own handwriting in the margins. The notes she had made at 12, in the careful characters of a girl who was being taught that the world had a language and that she was going to learn it. Her father's corrections were there too, in red ink, precise and without condescension. She did not think his words so much as she simply inhabited them. Power that announces itself is power that has already begun to shrink. It arrived not as instruction and not as memory, but as description. A statement about where she was sitting right now, in this garden, in this light, with this document and no audience at all. This is the narrator's thesis, offered plainly. The story was never about what Huang Wei did not know. He could have known. The information was always one conversation away, one document examined rather than signed without reading. The story was about what Mei-Lin chose to become during the years he was not paying attention. The woman she had always been, waiting with the patience her father had modeled for the moment that made becoming visible. She did not set out to be vindicated. She set out to be certain. The truth, once documented, handled itself. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever been underestimated by someone who depended on you, or waited quietly in a room where no one understood what you carried, tell us in the comments. We read every one. And tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. This community is everywhere, and we are always glad to know where. The garden in Suzhou was still when she finally rose from the bench. She carried the framed balance sheet back inside, to the room where her father's desk had always stood. She set it against the wall. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his handwriting in red ink beside hers in black, at the numbers that had once seemed enormous and now simply seemed like home. Then she turned off the light, and the room held everything quietly, the way rooms do when the right person has finally come to rest inside them.